The Andean droughts of today and 1500 years ago are straightforward examples of how the climate can change our lives. But sometimes it's not the direct impact on us that's the problem. The side effects can be equally devastating, as the inhabitants of 14th century Europe discovered. In less than 50 years, between a third and a half of the European population was wiped out. And once again, climate change was at the heart of the action. So what happened? And what would the most advanced society the world had ever known be able to do about it? In the early 14th century, half the population of medieval Europe was wiped out by one of the worst catastrophes in human history. The cause was a deadly disease, and it was unleashed by climate change. After 600 years of relative warmth, the 14th century saw the onset of a new period of cold, stormy weather. We call it the Little Ice Age. And it would transform the lives of every European. Before the Little Ice Age, medieval Europe was the preeminent civilization in the world. Politically, socially, and technologically. But in 1315, disaster struck, in the form of a series of intensely wet summers, unlike anything Europeans had experienced for centuries. The impact was immediate.
If we think about the beginning of the 14th century, this field would have been full at this time of year, people harvesting crops. But in 1315, there were the most terrible rainstorms all through the summer, and it just kept on raining, and it ruined the crop. And that sometimes happened in a bad year, but it happened again in 1316. There was an even worse harvest that year, and it causes a terrible famine.
For 3 years, the farmers were unable to grow sufficient crops to feed their families, let alone anyone else. The price of grain soared beyond the means of many, and famine cut a swathe through the rural population. How many people died?
It's quite difficult to tell, but it looks like about 10% of the population died, but that varied across the scale, so the very poorest suffered most. And there's quite good evidence to show that the landless, as many as 1 in 5, died because of hunger.
For those directly affected, it must have seemed like the end of the world. But there was worse to come. Much worse.
The thing I really wanted to show you is this graffito up here, which you can see, it looks incredibly fresh.
Yeah.
But it's probably inscribed around 1360.
What's it about?
Starting on the left, it says, a plague came probably in 1348, and then in 1350, a miserable, pitiable plague departed.
And what's underneath?
Well, and below that is something which I think is still very shocking and powerful. And someone has written there, and a miserable people are left who have witnessed it. And what they had witnessed was a great plague. It was the Black Death.
The Black Death was one of the worst pandemics in history. It began not in Europe, but in Asia, as a direct consequence of the impact of climate change on rodents.
Plague is a bacterial disease, but it's a disease ultimately of rodents. Rodents spread it to one another via their fleas. Sometimes it spills over into humans and causes a deadly disease.
Scientists from Oslo and Liverpool universities have been investigating how the plague responds to shifts in climate.
Plague is caused by a biological organism, and those biological organisms are as responsive to climate and climate changes as any other biological organisms. Plague in rodents is favoured in environments which are favourable, firstly for the rodents themselves, and then for the fleas, which are so important in the transmission of it. So that's damp weather, and also warm springs. The fleas are inclined to die if it gets too hot and dry, whereas if it's a bit damper, that's good for the fleas, good for the fleas, good for the rodents, good for plague.
At the beginning of the 14th century, conditions in Central Asia were particularly good for plague. As the climate was changing in Europe, so it was in Asia too, creating a wetter, warmer environment there. This caused rats and fleas to proliferate and plague to flourish. In about 1346, it broke out of Asia. Plague-infested rodents were transported west along trade routes by ships and across land by other means. It quickly spread into and across Europe.
Climate was truly instrumental in generating that source of plague, but other things, and largely human movement, were responsible for bringing plague into Europe.
It arrived in Britain in 1348, where it began to wreak havoc.
You can tell how terrified the people were from this 14th century account. It says, every spot which the sick had touched, their breath, their clothes, spread the contagion. Even the eyes of the patient were considered as sources of contagion. In other words, they believed that if someone with the Black Death just looked at you, they could give you the disease. And when it came to your life's end, those infected felt themselves penetrated by a pain throughout their whole bodies. Then there developed on their thighs or on their upper arms a boil about the size of a lentil, which the people called burn boil. This infected the whole body and penetrated it so that the patient violently vomited blood. This vomiting of blood continued without intermission for 3 days, there being no means of healing it, and then the patient expired.
The Black Death was a prolific taker of life in medieval Europe. It was certainly a virulent disease, but there was something else that made it particularly deadly. And a clue to that lies in the victims themselves. Dr. Dan Antoine was part of a team that excavated one of London's largest Black Death burial pits.
So These two people are probably Black Death victims.
Absolutely.
How many skeletons did you find altogether?
Approximately 650 were recovered, but we expect there was probably over 2,000 bodies buried in the cemetery of East Smithfield.
How were they buried?
Most of them side by side, so they were still carefully laid out, but they were just giant pits as opposed to individual graves.
Many of the victims were in their mid-30s or older, like this woman, when they died from the Black Death in 1348. This means they were in their infancy when the Great Famine began in 1315, evidence of which is still visible in their teeth.
You can see along the surface of the animal there are ridges, and these are disruptions to the normal formation of the teeth.
Yeah, this poor old person was in a right old state. What sort of thing do you think would have caused this?
As we're looking at the period of famine, it's most likely to be due to a poor nutrition. Anybody in their 30s would have been born just before the Great Famine and growing up during the famine years.
It's quite fascinating, really, isn't it? You've got climate change, and then you've got the famine, and then you've got the Black Death. Do you think there's a link between the three?
There must be. It would have affected a whole generation. This generation of individuals in their 30s, they would have all grown up in famine conditions, making them more susceptible in their adult life to disease, and most likely it would have affected the number of individuals who died from the Black Death.
And the final death toll was simply staggering. The Black Death wiped out between 1/3 and 2/3 of the entire population of Europe. In England alone, more than 2 million people are thought to have died of it. Remarkably, though, rather than collapse into the pages of history, medieval Europe and its inhabitants did something very surprising. They flourished. This is the medieval village of Lavenham in Suffolk.
Tony, look at this. This house illustrates all of the basic changes to the houses of ordinary people before and after the Black Death. Before the Black Death, if you can just imagine that that wing and that wing is not there, what we have is an open hall in the centre.
And what happened after the Black Death?
Well, after the Black Death, the building becomes extended and built to a higher quality. So, as you can see here, another wing is added on either side of the hall, and you'll also notice that there's a first floor has been inserted as well, which creates more spacious but more private accommodation with permanent internal divisions. So it's much more spacious, much higher quality accommodation.
So, far from being crushed by the Black Death, which is what I'd expected, the people who lived here seem to have been doing very well. Better, in fact, than they had been before the plague struck. So what was going on? Remarkably, the medieval inhabitants of Suffolk can tell us themselves. This is one of the few surviving records of the time which tells us what was happening in the local courts. And it documents the beginning of a major transformation in medieval society.
This is a court roll from 1352, and there are no deaths, and there's the usual activities going on between lord and peasant. But there's one in particular that caught my eye, and it reads that Isabella Spielman, Stephen Swillpot, Nicholas Horn, and about 6 or 7 other tenants were called to reap the Lord's corn in harvest and refused to come, instead working for other men for money. And this is a classic example of truculent workers after the Black Death, knowing that their labour is scarce, not wanting to do the demeaning and onerous labour services for free on the Lord's farm because people are offering them actually quite decent money to reap their corn elsewhere.
So, however ghastly the Black Death would have been for those who died and their loved ones, the fact is, for the survivors, in some strange, macabre way, the Black Death was a good thing.
The Black Death liberated those who survived. It liberated people from poverty because there were opportunities to work and acquire land. It liberated women. It gave them opportunities to work that weren't there before the Black Death. It was liberating individually if you were prepared to seize the opportunity and the chances that were available.
And many did seize those opportunities. Wages and living standards rose across Europe, working conditions improved, money and power began to trickle further down the social ladder. Suddenly, Europe was brimming with confidence.
That is such a beautiful building, isn't it? And that wasn't here before the Black Death?
There was a church here, but it was much smaller, much less ornate. This was constructed in the decades after the Black Death.
What strikes me is that it not only looks like something put up by really wealthy people, but very confident people, not people who are on their knees.
This is a great statement of their religious belief and also of their confidence and their wealth. That tower was meant to be seen miles away, and it commemorates God and the people who built it.
More efficiently than any revolution, the Black Death had reconfigured European society and opened a new chapter in the continent's history. The next 600 years would see European civilization progress from totalitarian to democratic, agricultural to industrial, medieval to modern.